All right, all right, all right. I hear Kanthan making some noise in the background.
He's just getting onto his machine. He's just getting onto his machine. He's almost ready. He's almost ready. I love that little avatar of yours, your little icon avatar, Gareth.
Oh, you do? This one?
Yeah.
It's just I don't even know how it got on there. It's like I think it's my Apple. You on your Apple ID, it gives you this avatar thing that you can make, and I don't know how it transferred to this thing, but it's somehow there. You know how sometimes you don't know like how technology is operating in the background, but it just does.
And it just does. I
Yeah.
don't know how years ago when Kaneho was much smaller, he changed my email, my Gmail or Apple iCloud to say Kaneho Mashego, I think it must be Josh. I change it every 6 months. And then I just get an email from a random person saying, "Who's Josh?"
Oh my God, it makes you seem like you're schizophrenic.
I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, but
Yeah.
that's story of my story
All right.
of my life.
I
And we're
see
on.
Relene wants to talk about pit bulls. So, Relene, I'm going to ask you if you can just hold that thought because we don't have time now on the burning platform and we do want to keep it to current affairs. Pit bulls can come in later, and then I'll give you the number and we can talk about that later. But I do see you on the comments and I will give you the number, but we can't do that today. So, you'll just
So
have to wait.
here's a developing story that was in the Herald. Speaking of dogs, that was in the Herald, which has a little bit of a political slant because it involves Andile Lungisa
Hmm.
and two missing dogs.
What happened?
3 years these dogs were missing, and Andile Lungisa is embroiled in this scandal that's unfolding out there. And it was in the Herald yesterday.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if he shipped the dogs to China, but the dogs are back with their owner, a Weimaraner, and I think the second one was a pit bull.
Weimaranas are not inexpensive, guys. You know.
I know this,
Mhm.
but
That's
Andile Lungisa.
very expensive. So, Kanthan, how the hell are you?
I'm fit and fabulous, guys. Good to see you all looking so bright and chirpy. Gareth, you look all huddled up almost as though it's winter.
Well, I'm sorry. I'm extremely sensitive to winter. It's why I think I praise my ancestors every day for coming to a sunnier place.
Here we are.
Uh-huh.
All right. So let's get into some things, guys, before Rafiq joins us, because there's a lot to catch up on here. Just in this week, we've seen Parliament, and Pumi and I touched on this a little bit earlier. When they want to do something, when there's enough media pressure and when there's enough public pressure, like this Thabo Bester situation, can I just say that it's impressive to see how Parliament can quickly call a subcommittee and they can start an investigation and they can subpoena people,
Visit
or
the
rather
prison.
summons them.
On-site visit.
Yeah.
Oh,
They can
guys, you've been distracted again. I mean, as far as we are aware, in the entire history of these corrupt bastards running the prison system, there are 3 people that we know that have actually escaped. All right, so there's only 3 people. Yeah, there's only 3 people that we know of during this entire time. So I would say that that's a fairly good success record.
I think
Parliament is very happy to get together whenever the private sector does anything wrong. But at the point at which Parliament needs to turn its scrutiny upon itself, and you guys made exactly the point this morning. Where the fuck is the lifestyle audit for our Minister of Electricity wearing a 2 million rand watch on his wrist?
Mm-hmm.
Guys, why are we being distracted?
Or as I said to Pumi, why is the Department of Correctional Services so defunct and so useless and so incompetent that they have to hire at great cost these private companies? And then we blame the private companies when there's no oversight.
Why do police stations have ADT subscriptions?
Right. It is absolutely perverse.
The lunatics are running the asylum, guys. It's been the case for a while.
So do you have a comment on what Pumi asked me earlier? Because she's very she's very interested in this coalition of the corrupt versus the the ANC, the DA, whoever they are, the Rainbow Coalition. That that John Steenhuisen is trying to build here. And I know we touched on this last week already, but now the Patriotic Alliance are going from this side to this side, and it all seems to me like it's just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And I don't see the Patriotic Alliance's deck chair as being a particularly significant one.
Remember, we touched on this when we had Helen in the studio with us, and one of the points that I raised at the time, we need to work towards actually formalizing coalition structures. And from my perspective, the way in which you formalize coalition structures is you have agreements that are financially binding, so that if a party breaks it, there's actually a real cost on a personal basis to the individuals. And I think that that's actually something important that we need to be doing. But Gareth, I also agree with you that it's rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, because, again, none of them are addressing the most basic thing, is how to get people out to vote for any of the people who are part of the coalition of the corrupt. And if we don't get those 11 million people mobilized to the polls, it's not going to make a difference, because you are going to have the ANC and the EFF still pulling more than 50% in most of the country.
And Panyaza Lusufi has finally come out and actually said that that's what they're working on.
Oh, that racist bastard. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. I called him out on that.
But why
he only goes after Afrikaans schools. That's why I say he's a racist bastard. Let him sue me.
Okay. All right. Well, you see Kanthan putting it all on the block this morning. There's no quiet and considered moment with you. It's all like fire, non-stop.
Okay, so while we're waiting for Rafiq, so can I give you guys my hot take?
Yes, go on.
Okay, so, I've got this whole thing of, I always go back and revisit my initial premise, right? Because Gareth and Pumi, I think, one of the things that we need to do as human beings is we need to actually be constantly saying, what if I was wrong in this entire process? Okay, and so for, the longest time, I've bought into the entire narrative around state capture that originated with Thuli Madonsela's State of Capture report. And, for the past several years, we've been down this rabbit hole of the Zondo Commission, which Pumi quite meticulously documented for us over that entire period. And all of this culminated in the mess that resulted in the Guptas not getting extradited. And everyone was trying to point fingers at the diplomatic corps. But my fundamental point was, what if we have not actually been able to show a case against the Guptas? And I now go back and I look through all of the reporting that we've actually had at the time. And remember, one of the most crucial things that we've got here is that the Guptas unduly profited. But remember that unduly profiting in of itself is not a crime. Okay, particularly when you have people in government who have actually facilitated those deals. It's a question of getting jobs for pals. And so we've spent these past years, kind of waiting expectantly on the sidelines for something to actually drop, because we've been told that these guys are corrupt bastards and that they need to go to jail. But what at the end of the day, when presented to the judicial authorities in the UAE, it actually turns out that there's not enough to actually justify an extradition. So that's my hot take. So I now go back and take a look at the issues that were in place around when Jacob Zuma was around. Okay, so did he put an end to load shedding? Yes, he did put an end to load shedding. All right, so that's the most crucial piece of the puzzle that I want to highlight. Okay. So what then if the entire State of Capture report and the entire judicial process out there was just simply a color revolution that was actually fostered by the people who fund Cyril Ramaphosa? And I'm not going to point fingers at any particular country funding him, but it was US dollars that was found in his mattress, not rubles. All right. And we've had a country since then that has degenerated into chaos, that has been pushing fundamentally a woke agenda from the highest echelons of power in the country. And look, in terms of the amount of money that's being poured down this rabbit hole of renewables, and you look at the people who are involved in there, and guys, I think this is the most fundamental level of state capture, but we've been distracted. So that's my current thought process. I'm not nailing my colors to that mast yet. I've got to do a lot more research into this, but that's where my thought process is going right now.
This is quite a bomb you're dropping. I mean, this is extraordinary stuff. You're questioning the state capture narrative.
A narrative which I bought into, guys, and I think I think all of us bought into it.
Oh, well, we were sold at foot stewards, and it seemed like a great scapegoat.
Yep.
But as you know, I was never a fan to begin with when Cyril was touted as the big change that we needed and the savior and the silver bullet to it all. But I do think that there are many components to what we were sold with what the state capture, not just the report, but also all of the various pieces of this puzzle. Gareth, you had my very good friend on one of your shows, Mathangoye, who was at PRASA, and she talks about all of the malicious things that have happened there and continue to happen, right? And those components, and we saw what happened with Denal and the falling apart of that. We saw what happened, so it's not just one big thing. It's many small things. And I think one of the things that has been the greatest injustice over the past couple of years is not being able to bring not a single person to book, and therefore not stopped any of the maliciousness that has been happening behind the scenes. It is not a fabrication that various components of our country, the infrastructure is falling apart because it is not being properly maintained, because somebody is eating the money. That is not a fabrication, nor is it some kind of bogeyman that was there to get rid of some person and put in other people. And it has been continuing. In fact, it's gotten worse in the time that we now have the silver bullet called Cyril Ramaphosa.
That's all the proof you need, is that the people who say state capture was a thing, a Zuma thing, for the Zuma years, they can't account for why it's still going on, right? Because if supposedly all those people, the whole coterie around Jacob Zuma were the problem, and again, Cyril has some tough explaining to do about how he was part of that as well. But if they were the problem and they are now out of power, how come the corruption and money laundering and fraud continues?
It has gotten worse, if anything, So a couple of days ago, I don't know if you saw the videos of Thabo Mbeki's motorcade after being, after his big open letter to not the Secretary General, but to the now Deputy President of the party, and, decrying the state at which the ANC is, and how it's fallen out of lockstep with the people and no longer serves the people, yada, 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 right? So now they ghosted him for 3 weeks. And a couple of days ago, there was videos of him arriving, and they did put out a statement actually from the Secretary General's office saying that they have had a very collegial and fruitful engagement with the former president with regard to changing what is happening within the party. And what's the magic word? Renewal of the party. So that it can become.
I'm going to have to park all these questions for a moment, and it's going to leave lots of people feeling dissatisfied, because we could talk about this some more, and maybe we will with our guest. But I want to introduce Raf Gangat, who's been a guest on my show before. He is a philosopher, a cricketer, a music impresario, a broadcaster, writer, and was the first ever career diplomat of color for South Africa all those years ago. He served as a vice consul in America, became a spokesperson for the Department of Foreign Affairs. He was in Karachi as our consul general, ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. He was also ambassador to Palestine and lives in Israel now, in Jerusalem. He is our guest this morning. And Raf, it's good to see you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's lovely to see all you guys. I'm here. I'm listening to what you guys are talking about, what's happening in my beloved country, and all I can say is, cry the beloved country.
Well, let's hope that we can get more than tears out of you this morning, because there's quite a lot. So you've got a few things that I think might be very interesting to South Africa, because we are constantly told in the mainstream media about the situation in Israel, in Palestine, in the Middle East. We're given probably only a few versions of the story, which is always complicated because there are many. And this part of the world continues to fascinate all of us. In some people's minds, it's now boring because it's been going on for so long. But tell us what's been going on with these protests in Israel over judicial reform. And maybe you can explain to people in South Africa who don't know why it is that so many people took to the streets to complain about Netanyahu's desire to reform the judiciary.
Okay, we had lots of issues about elections and different formations and different governments forming. What finally happened was the last elections, Netanyahu formed a coalition with the extreme right. And that just pissed off a lot of people on the center and so-called left. And what he intended to do was, okay, the first thing he did was he brought in members of the extreme right. He brought in somebody like Ben Gvir, who is, I don't know if there's a South African equivalent, and he promised him his own little militia. And then he brought in another extreme right guy called Smonich, and he gave him the finance ministry and the settlements. So the majority of, I would say, people from the Tel Aviv area got upset about this, and then they went about with this whole judicial reform story, whereby they want to reform the judiciary, where the legislative sector of government would now appoint the judges. So basically, the checks and balances are gone, and that's the whole issue. It's about checks and balances. Previously in Israel, you've had a president going to prison for rape. You've had a prime minister going to prison for fraud. It's democracy in action. It works. If you talk about Israel and Israel's democracy, yes, for the Israelis, it's a democracy. Talking about the West Bank and the Palestinians, that's another story. We won't get into that right now. So it's a democracy, it's a fact. And now this government headed by Netanyahu wants to change all this, wants to appoint judges, and wants to change the whole judiciary system. And that's where you got all in very simple terms, that's where the demonstrations are taking place and people don't want it. And he's held back. We've had the Passover holidays, and he's promised his side, the right wing, that after the Passover holidays, we'll continue with it. Meanwhile, he's bought time. But even if he's bought time, the demonstrations are continuing. People are not going to give in. I hope that answers it.
Rafik, the interesting reports that were floating around yesterday that shows that Mossad was actually implicated in organizing a lot of the riots that took place. I don't know if you guys have heard anything about that in that part of the world.
Yeah, we've heard about that. And in fact, what has been happening is that people from the side of the military, the generals, previous generals, the military, the pilots, everybody's been involved in this. And now it wasn't, we're not surprised to hear that Mossad has been involved in this as well. I'm trying to simplify this, all right? It's seculars versus the religious right. And most of the people, the intellectuals, the people who really run the country, the intellectual right, are fighting the seculars. The intellectual rights are fighting the extreme right, and it's going to get worse.
Rafik, I have a question about talking about the people that run the country and what we are seeing over here, just in terms of the sheer numbers of people that are involved in all of these protests out in the street, is how does a Netanyahu rise to the position if so many people, in a democracy that works, if so many people are against what he stands for, How did he get the position if so many people are against him?
But you know the answer yourself already, Pumi. It's a coalition of the corrupt. You know this. You spoke about it earlier on.
No, really, because I mean, and this is something that particularly interests me here in South Africa, because we hear lots of people say particular things, but when it comes to showing up on the polls, people are not showing up in the way that they speak out in. Is that the same thing that happens?
Okay, in terms of the recent polls, his popularity has plummeted. If you have elections tomorrow, he's gone. But he has a coalition that's holding together for now, and he's a damn good politician. You know, I mean, he knew everything was on the line. He held back until after the Passover holidays, and he's got the president involved now to speak to everyone and form some kind of compromise. Right? He's a damn good politician, and he's a survivor. We'll
mobilizing everyone to
yeah.
stay out of prison.
Exactly.
And
sorry.
Rafiq, I also noticed that, whenever it hits the fan for politicians in Israel, the first thing that they do is go after Palestine.
It brings them all together.
Yes, but are we ever going to get to the stage where people in Israel, and look, particularly in Tel Aviv, because I'd also like you to touch on, because I'm sensing that there's kind of an urban-rural divide, so to speak, that's kind of happening right now, with Tel Aviv being strongly opposed to a lot of the stuff that Netanyahu has been doing, but the larger country, perhaps being more conservative, taking a different view on it. But surely this thing about using the bombing of Palestinians as a distraction whenever there is political turmoil, how do we get to the point where eventually people say, no, we actually want to, put that aside and focus on the real stuff that's going on? Because I have a sense that it's almost at the point where you can get Israelis to start saying enough is enough on that.
Yeah, it happened this time around. I mean, the bombing of the Palestinians happened, and everybody expected there will be, both factions would unite and come together. But it didn't happen. I mean, last Saturday we had demonstrations once more. The demonstrations are continuing, bombing or no bombing. They're just adamant on that side. And you're right, it's a rural versus, it's the settlers. Netanyahu has brought the settlers on his side and the extreme right settlers, and it's the urban, Tel Aviv crowd, and for the big cities as well. So we have a clash. We have a big clash, but the Tel Aviv crowd is not they're not giving in.
In the interests of pursuing that clash further in the show, I'm a big Netanyahu fan, and I know that's not going to make me the majority on this show. But I can't help but notice the terminology difference, Raf, between the way you explain the extreme right and the so-called left. It seems to me that you bring your own bias to bear here, and I always find that extremely interesting. Do you want to explain why you think there's only a so-called left, but there's an extreme right?
There is no left. Really? the left in Israel is gone, right? It's completely. Meretz and all the left-wing parties are gone, and if Netanyahu calls anyone who opposes him left. And the people who really oppose him are not really left. They're centrists or on the right. And
there's
we have...
There's nothing of the left. Okay.
Yeah, there's nothing left of the left.
These new ideas, not just in Israel, all over the world.
He's a very clever politician. All right. I do want to hear, because we seldom get an objective point of view. I know that you keep up to date with South Africa and the news that you obviously read about. What do people say about South Africa in Israel?
We read about, I get up every morning and I read the news and I get depressed every morning. I worked in government. I was a diplomat. Kanthan just spoke earlier about what's happening with the Guptas and all of that stuff. I was an ambassador in Abu Dhabi. I was the first South African diplomat. I set up the whole thing in Abu Dhabi. And I think, immediately when I read that, and then people from South Africa called me and said, what's your take on this? And I said, I smell a rat, right? Let's be frank. I was an ambassador there. I know how the whole system works there. The ambassador has a special relationship with the royal family. The royal family runs the show. And if you want anything done, you don't work through the system. You go to the royal family and you talk to the royal family, and the royal family just facilitates things. It's not a democracy. It's a family business, And when I needed anything to be done, I didn't go to this ministry or that ministry. I went right to the top and got things done. So if I was the ambassador there, I would go right to the top and say, we need this to be done, and it gets done. So I don't know what happened. And I remember at one stage, there was talk about, there's time spent, we have to translate the Arabic and all that kind of stuff. Come on, the embassy has a full-time translator. The embassy has a full-time they have a full-time translator who's paid by the South African taxpayer, who works full-time to do immediate translations. Come on. Right from the beginning, this was not right. So, I smell a rat. I can't point a finger. What I can say, this is just supposition that if the Guptas come back to South Africa, they can spill the beans on a lot of people. So it's better they just stay in Dubai. Kanthan agrees with that.
Oh, they're not in Dubai anymore. They're now the citizens of, what is that?
Vanuatu.
Oh, Vanuatu, yeah.
Oh, right.
Lovely stuff.
Which has no extradition treaties with South Africa.
A little island nation. Very interesting.
They probably own the island with all the money they left with.
Yeah, probably. It's a hell of a story. So Raf, when you come to this thing about the diplomatic corps and how it works, you probably still have friends who work in what do we call the DIRCO, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. I've got a friend who's there, and she tells me it's all really running very nicely. Now, Lady Pandor is an excellent minister. They've got their priorities right. They're involving themselves in the conversations that will benefit South Africa from a trade point of view and from the people we align ourselves with internationally. Was there a kind of coordination in your day that you don't see there now, or am I being super critical just because this is the time that we're in and I'm paying attention?
Okay, I left the diplomatic corps a long time ago, and one of the reasons I left, it's a long story, is what really started happening was we had professionals, and then all these cadres came in, with no knowledge whatsoever. Somebody held a gun somewhere or somebody did something, and suddenly this guy is placed above me as a boss, and he doesn't know anything. And it's this whole cadre appointments that just really got me upset with the diplomatic corps at that stage. And I had my personal issues with a lot of people, and finally I resigned. But I've followed a lot since then. Yes, Naledi Pandu is far better than what we've had previously, right? She's really,
Kwana Mashabane, yeah, she was terrific.
Yeah. I worked with her at one stage. I can write a book about that. But anyway, Naledi is pretty good, and I think we have some really good, people out there. But generally, the diplomatic corps that I knew, that I worked in, the professionals that I worked with, I don't see that anymore. There's just been a general decline.
Holmes, you wanted to ask something?
Well, just talking about the professionalism and then having all of these cadres and the politicians in place. One of the things that I'm quite interested in as a South African now living in Israel, there's quite a lot of talk here at home, and Naledi is one of the big proponents of this, of the Palestinian apartheid state and South Africa's role in kind of ostracizing, and they downgraded the embassy in Israel at some point, and the tensions that comes with, sitting in Israel, looking back here at home. How is South Africa perceived politically where you are?
South Africa punches above its weight, when it comes to this issue. In the days of Madiba, yes, South Africa had the moral authority to, punch above its weight, but today it can't. And this whole thing about downgrading the embassy in Tel Aviv, I have issues with that. Countries in the apartheid era, countries that were very anti-South Africa and pro-ANC, they still maintained embassies in South Africa. They had ambassadors in South Africa, and that's the way you engage with the country. You don't walk away. You don't take your ambassador out of the country. You keep your ambassador there. You engage with the country. That's what diplomacy is all about. And I think removing the ambassador, does it make any difference to Israel? South Africa is a puny little country as far as Israel is concerned. And does it, in fact, is we shooting ourselves in the foot by doing that? But by having an ambassador, if something happens, the ambassador can then go up to the highest levels, make his concerns, felt, and convey the messages from one government to another government, and stuff like that. I don't know. I think it was very short-sighted and very foolish. That's my personal opinion. I'm no longer a diplomat, but but having been a diplomat, and I've seen, even in the worst days of apartheid, countries in the forefront of the struggle outside maintained embassies and ambassadors, and they always were there to condemn, criticize, and so forth.
Yeah. Look, Kanthan, you want to say something?
No, I was going to say that, Rafik, you've got a really unique insights in that, you've got this very strong background in diplomacy, and you literally in the heart of the conflict zone, so to speak. And I think that, maybe if you can do just a bit of reading the tea leaves for us, against the backdrop of, we spoke about the protests that are happening. There's the invasion of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was, unprecedented, and now these airstrikes against Syria. But you've also got reports coming out this week that Iran's on the brink of acquisition of nukes. You've got the Chinese now turning around and saying that there has to be a formalization of a two-state solution that's happening between Israel and Palestine. You've got very clear evidence that the Biden regime is very firmly against the Netanyahu regime and has been agitating stuff behind the scenes. And you've got this entire global shift that's happening in terms of people moving across onto the BRIC side. So read the tea leaves for me, just in terms of what's happening right now, particularly with the Israel-Palestine situation. Is this going to be better? Is this going to be just ramping up of the current conflict? What's actually, where do you see this going?
It's a loaded question. It requires a lot of I wish I could do a TikTok less than a minute kind of thing. Okay. The question you pose, that's the next book I'm working on. I'm writing this book, Is Israel an Apartheid State? I have a unique insight. I came here as a diplomat 20 years ago, and I sat on the ring side, on the Palestinian side of the ring, and watched the conflict from the Palestinian side. Thereafter, I got into the ring and I became a talk show host on the only political talk show in English between the two sides. And it was a unique talk show host in that sense that, being a South African, if I had an Israeli guest, I would sit in the studio in Jerusalem. If I had a Palestinian guest, I would sit in the studio in Ramallah. And for the first time, Israeli politicians and Palestinian politicians, through me, were being questioned by Israelis and Palestinians in a neutral language, English. That's the story of my book, Music Has No Boundaries. Today, I sit as an objective observer right in the back, and I watch the whole thing. So I've had three different viewpoints on what's been happening here. And the point that you raised, looking at the tea leaves, if I can go back to the South African experience, apartheid ended because of the Berlin Wall coming down. That's the way I see it. With whatever was happening, when the Berlin Wall came down, it had a whole effect, and that saw the beginning of the end of apartheid. And now you're seeing the de-dollarization process. America is no longer this unipower you have this multi-polar world emerging with Russia, China, Iran playing a role now. Saudi Arabia is now being to get out of the clutch holes of the American thing. And I mean, you've seen these leaks now, the Pentagon leaks, that the United Arab Emirates is closing out to Russia. All these things are happening, and America is losing its grip on the whole world. And with this happening, you're going to see a domino effect everywhere in the world, including this part of the world too. I can't predict what's going to happen, but things are going to start happening. Does that answer your question?
Well, I think it pretty much ties in with where my thinking has been going on this. Like you have been trying to take a kind of rear view in terms of this. I don't generally buy into the narrative that Israel's an apartheid state, because that labeling things is just kind of sloppy from my perspective. It doesn't allow you the opportunity to actually inject nuance into a conversation. And the fascinating thing for me are the diplomatic back channels that you've touched on to some extent. Those back channels between Israel and Russia are very strong, and they always have been. And the fact is that Putin actually has a direct line to Netanyahu on his desk, and is one of the few people in the world that he will actually take a call from. At the same time, you've got this very strong relationship now between Russia and Iran. You've got China throwing its hat into the ring as well. And at the same time, you've got the Biden administration very anxious to have a regime change in Israel, and so it's a bit of a mess for me. But I suppose what I'm looking for is a sign of hope that there can actually be some sort of an end to the bombing would be nice. I'd really like to see an end to the rockets flying, between both territories, and someone actually now trying to step in and actually trying to broker a peace deal. And I think with the U.S. actually having a waning star, I'm hopeful that's going to happen, but I'm not seeing a pathway to getting there. Gareth, you have that wry smile on your face, the Netanyahu fan.
Who would it be? Who would referee this if not the United States? I mean, clearly, the Palestinians have had their problems with the United States in the past.
Look, if China can bring the Iranians and the Saudis together, my word.
Yeah, that's quite an achievement.
Mm.
Well, and if you look at the fact that more and more of all of those countries talk about the back channels, the diplomatic back channels, talking about like their Abraham Accords, and the fact that more and more of them are signing up onto that, you then do quite honestly have a shifting power in that region that is moving towards a working with each other. And then, just to bring it back home to South Africa, where we have a minister who's very emotional about what's happening over there and failing to see and read the tea leaves, to use your earlier analogy, Kanthan, and failing to read the tea leaves, and therefore closing off for a country like ours that has so many problems, an opportunity to reach out and actually win from solutions that live in that region. I mean, we could learn a lot from Israel, not just in terms of what they've been able to do with their country and the country that they've built in the middle of the desert, but also from their technology, from their agriculture. And people who listen to the show know that, I personally have had an experience where we've been able to bring technology that's changed the lives of people here in this country. And here we have a very emotional and small-minded minister, in my view, who is looking at, I don't know, I'm not sure what it is that she's looking at that makes her make the decisions and make the sounds that she makes.
Well, it's all binary to so many people in the ANC. It's either, are you our friend or are you not our friend? Were you our friend in the past or are you still our friend? It's kind of this legacy stuff which doesn't seem to compute with a world that is constantly changing. I'm curious about the question that Kanthan asked, who the next adjudicator should be. And this leads us on to an interesting discussion, which I think, Raf, you can join in on, because you're also watching the world and how international politics are changing. This BRICS thing seems to be the talk of the town at the moment. We see kind of an effeteness in the Biden regime in terms of trying to tame what is clearly going to become an alternative. How do you feel about BRICS? How do you feel about this new coalition and the fact that it may silently and in a very direct way start harming American interests, in inverted commas, as opposed to the interests of these countries themselves?
It's already happening. I mean, with BRICS, the BRICS countries, China now is trading with Russia. They're moving away from the dollars. I mean, like the other day, I read something about Malaysia and China, trading in their own currencies. The whole BRICS, the BRICS coalition, and moving away from the de-dollarization, it's going to affect America big time. That alone is just one indication. And now you got other countries like Saudi Arabia want to join BRICS. UAE wants to join BRICS. So you have a multipolar world emerging from a unipolar American-dominated world, which is good for the whole world. In fact.
Yeah. All right, Raf, I'm gonna let you go because your connection is breaking up quite badly. And thank you for being on the show this morning. We will check in with you again soon. Appreciate your contribution, and of course, people can find out more. Where can we get hold of you?
Where you got hold of me now.
This is your ad break.
Yeah. There's no social media tag that we can put on.
He doesn't tweet.
There's a website. We'll put it out.
There's a website.
Yeah, I have a website. And I've just published my new book, which is called Music Has No Boundaries. It's a story about what we did. We tried to bring the South African radio experience, the 72 experience, what 72 did in South Africa, to this part of the world. It was an amazing experience, and the experiment that worked for a while, and we got closed down. Some of us went to prison, right? And the whole story is told for the very first time. And from that story comes another story, the first woman radio station in the Arab world, Radio Nisa FM, and it's a story about two radio stations.
Sorry, Raf, it's getting very, very. The connection is breaking up, but we will.
Okay.
Music Has No Boundaries is the book by Raf Gangat. He will give us the details, and we'll put it up on the website, and you can obviously get it over there. But I do want to have us continue this conversation, if you don't mind, Kanthan and Pumi, because I do not think we've completely extinguished the subject of what's going on with this BRICS move. And there have been new developments. I mean, the U.S. Central Bank, the U.S. Federal Reserve, as they call themselves, has started rolling out, as they promised they would, in April of 2023. They said they would start to play with the idea of a central digital currency. How do we feel about that, Kanthan?
We could probably devote an entire show talking about this stuff, Gareth, because it's really interesting. Okay, so let me just kind of break down where my thought process is on this right now. Okay, to a large extent, the reason why the US has been able to maintain the outrageous trade deficits that they have, and right now, in terms of the balance of trade, the US is going to top $1 trillion in the next year. They hit 980 something billion in this year. And you see, the only way you can keep doing that as a country is if you do what the US has had the ability to do, which is to print an unlimited number of US dollars. Now, what's been happening, and it's directly as a result of Biden's stupidity of sanctioning Russia, that you've had almost every country in the world saying, well, if the US can actually take my money at any given stage, I really don't want to be keeping my fortunes with the US as a reserve currency. And so they've been moving to gold. We know already that, Russia has been buying a massive amount of gold. China, in addition to being one of the biggest gold producers in the world, has been a net importer of gold. India has surreptitiously bought up most of the world's silver market over the past 4 or 5 years. And you've now got the entry of the likes of the Saudis. No doubt Venezuela is going to be part of that mix as well. You've now got Brazil coming into it as well. And all of them are bringing their own resources to bear at the same time.
What are we bringing if we're the S in BRICS? Because
we're very small S.
No, actually,
because Raf said Saudi Arabia might join. I'm thinking they'll just take our S and we'll just be thrown out.
No, I think people actually forget that if you look at a lot of the materials that the resources that are actually necessary in the world right now, and I've touched on this when people say we shouldn't piss off the US because they're going to cut trade ties with us. No, actually, there's a lot of materials where the US is fundamentally dependent on having us there. Uranium being a case in point. If not for the fact that we're able to be a regular supplier of uranium, the US would be forced to deal with Russia. Now, my view is that we should actually be putting a stranglehold on our uranium exports. We should be beneficiating our uranium exports instead of shipping it off to Westinghouse in the US to get them to process it.
Are we still actively mining uranium in any meaningful way in South Africa?
Well, remember that uranium in the South African context has always been a byproduct of gold mining. Okay, which is why I keep telling people, don't build houses on mine dumps because they're radioactive. So,
right.
but my point is that we've had the resources all the time. So it's uranium, it's chrome. Our coal reserves are still absolutely massive, and you can see that by the hundreds upon hundreds of trucks that are lined up to get into Richards Bay and just load up onto ships. So we've still got a massive amount of resources that we can bring to bear. And the idea of actually using those resources to shore up the value of the currency, is going to give us a real stake in BRICS. And I think that almost every country right now that's coming in there. But look, let's just step back to the US dollar scenario, because that becomes the crucial bit. What it means is that in the old days, people were very happy to hold US dollars because, it meant that they would buy oil, for example, in US dollars, and it was the main reason for holding onto the US dollars. And of course, they could then purchase stuff directly from the US as well. But when you no longer have a need to hold US dollars and you start offloading your dollars, those dollars then flow back into the US. And when those dollars flow back into the US, they've really got nowhere to go. So you're doubling the money supply in the US. Because remember, Biden printed $4 trillion during his time. Okay, so he effectively doubled the money supply during his term. Now, if you have that flowing back into the US, okay, if your economy is worth X number of dollars and you double the number of dollars in circulation, then that means that you're halving the value of the dollar in real terms, which is why inflation in the US has been, absolutely going through the roof. So
let me ask you about that quickly. So, hold on, because it almost sounds, and a conspiracy theorist might say that is sabotage. Why would the US government allow this to happen? Because is it because they didn't see the consequences of these decisions?
Now, Gareth, you're asking exactly the right question, because this is where my thought process has been going. Okay, because what if the entire process of de-dollarization, the sabotaging of the greenback, has actually been part of an overall plan by the US deep state to suddenly rip out the dollar and replace it with this federal digital currency that effectively is going to be able to track the movements of every individual within the United States. Okay, so you suddenly have a point at which all of the dollars that are in circulation effectively become valueless, because the only way you can get it back into circulation is by legally declaring them and putting them on the table. Now, Modi did something very similar when he came into power in India. You might remember that what he did was he immediately outlawed all notes that had been printed before his tenure. And he said, you have a limited period in which you can bring back this money and deposit it into your bank accounts. Otherwise, it's going to become worthless after a particular date. There were riots and so forth that actually took place at the time. But what it meant was that a lot of printed money that people were holding as cash hoards suddenly got ripped out of circulation, kind of almost overnight. It just became worthless pieces of paper. And if you look at all of the talk that's been going on right now in the US, particularly from the likes of Yellen and other people in the Biden administration, of moving towards this centralized digital currency, it does effectively become a way that the US can perform this great reset that they've been talking about. Okay, where, you'll have no wealth and you'll be happy with it.
But part of the reason why the great reset that the US has been talking about, and it's also the reason why we wake up this morning and the former finance minister of Greece, he of the center of Grexit, also says, he wishes they could have had China as a banker too, because the US for many, many years has weaponized their dollar. So whether it is their dollar or it is a central digital currency, the point is that the world is losing faith in what the US does and says and how that keeps the peace around the world. Just talking of the digital currencies, I mean, a similar thing is what happened in Nigeria just ahead of the elections. They tried to rip out all of the money in circulation and replace it with the digital currency because notoriously, Nigerians buy their elections. Nigerian politicians buy the ballot. So look, I think one of the things that when I look at what's happening, and as you know, I like to bring it all back home to South Africa, is all of those things, all our rich reserves, all of the platinum and the gold and the coal that we have really doesn't give us much of a bargaining power if our politicians are self-serving and stupid, which is what we have to deal with at the moment. They do not see the bigger picture of the politics at play and are emotional about a lot of the decisions that they are making. And that, unfortunately, even with our reserves, puts us in a bad position.
All right. Thank you, Pumi. Thank you, Kanthan. Thank you to everybody who joined us this morning on the Burning Platform, and to Raf Gangat, our guest from earlier. We will catch up again next week, Thursday, for some more of the Burning Platform. And don't forget, tonight we have Uncancelled with Professor Bakeng, which is going to be interesting. Pumi's going to be joining me.
Gareth, you're wrapping up a couple of minutes early, so let me just get...
Sorry.
One more thing to say.
No, I want to get one. No, guys, I just want to humbly and unreservedly apologize to Panyaza Lusufi for calling him a racist bastard. I have no idea whether his parents are married. I misspoke, and I apologize unreservedly.
All right, leaving us on a clanger. I love it. Thank you. All right, there we go. That is none other than Kanthan Pillay. And you can find all of us on social media. If you want to send us an email, send it to contact@cliffcentral.com. We will see you tomorrow at 6 a.m. Have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye.